In Turkey, protesters are angry about foreign troops entering their country to station Patriot missiles along the border with Syria. In Syria, government forces are still battling insurgents supported by the US and its regional allies. But what's made the situation even more complicated are reports about a rising wave of hatred among Syrians against militants partnered with Al-Queda and referred to as death squads. What does this mean for the West's support for the militants and the end of a battle that President Bashar al-Assad has shown he is willing to fight until the end? Why does the US and its allies help pro-Al-Queda armed men in Syria but fight the same groups in Mali? Does Washington believe in good terrorists and bad terrorists? This is the debate.
Another failure for foreign-backed Syrian opposition groups. A statement from the so-called Syrian National Coalition says opposition leaders have postponed the formation of a transitional government. The talks launched on Saturday have been the group's second bid to form a government. They only managed to create a 5-person committee to consult with other anti-Damascus groups as well as their foreign backers before making proposals to an interim body. Some sources say the opposition also wants to secure financial aid from its supporters. The group's next meeting is scheduled to be held in Paris at the end of this month. Meanwhile, inside Syria, heavy clashes are underway between foreign-backed insurgents and government forces. In the northern Hama province, the army managed to purge some areas of militant groups following fierce fighting. Government forces also inflicted heavy losses on the insurgents in Idlib, Homs and Aleppo. The troops are trying to block routes used by insurgents to import weapons from Turkey. Turkey itself has been witnessing growing public anger over the deployment of NATO soldiers and Patriot missile batteries near the Syrian border. The protesters are outraged over what they call Ankara's interventionist policies towards Syria. On Monday, police detained dozens of protesters and activists who are opposed to NATO's mission in their country. More than 24 demonstrators were arrested after they tried to get through the barricade at Incirlik Air Base in the city of Adana. They were protesting the arrival of Dutch troops who will take part in the NATO-led mission to deploy Patriot missile batteries along the Syrian border. More than 1,000 American, German and Dutch troops are to be based in Turkey to operate the batteries. NATO claims the move is meant to defend Turkey against any possible threat coming from Syria, where a bloody conflict is going on. This as the US and its Western and regional allies continue their steadfast financial and logistics support for Al-Qaeda-linked militants fighting against the Syrian government. They recognize these militants as the true representatives of the Syrian people. Surprisingly, the West is fighting similar pro-Al-Qaeda groups in the northern African country of Mali under the pretext of fighting terrorism.
Well, joining me now live from London is political analyst Mr. Sukant Chandan. I'd also like to welcome investigative journalist Mr. Lee Kaplan with us from Berkeley, and also former US Senate foreign policy analyst Mr. James Jatras with us live from Washington. Welcome to the debate, gentlemen. My first question to our guest, Mr. Jatras in Washington. Again, the question that we raised at the beginning of the show: why does the US and its allies fund and arm terrorist groups like the Al-Nusra Front in Syria? At the same time, they're fighting groups linked to Al-Qaeda in Mali. Are there good terrorists and bad terrorists in US foreign policy?
I think that a lot of people in Washington in the foreign policy establishment do operate on that assumption, that if we can adopt these causes of militant Islamic groups, particularly Sunni groups, we can somehow blunt their more radical tendencies. And we saw this going back to the Afghan war against the Soviet Union, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Libya, and now we see it in Syria. It seems to me this is a very naive and dangerous policy, because what you end up doing is not moderating the appetites of such groups, but rather whetting their radical appetites. and this inevitably results in blowback. We can see what's going on in Algeria and Mali as a blowback from our misguided intervention in Libya, in my opinion. And I think we could see the same thing in Syria, where far from moderating the outcome if the Assad government loses power, we will be empowering radical groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and then wondering, oh gosh, what do we do now that these maniacs are in power?
Let's just bring in Mr. Lee Kaplan on this as well with us live from Berkeley. Mr. Kaplan, I guess they're in Washington saying that rather than playing a moderating role in Syria, the United States and its allies are right now, in his words, empowering the al-Nusra Front, the terrorist group. Let's have your opinion on this as well.
Well, he's right. He's right in many ways. I would question whether or not the U.S. really needs to get a dog into the fight. However, it is the attitude, I believe, of our foreign policy advisors in the United States that the Velati Faqih regime in Iran has to be contained. Right now, Iran is very adamant about developing nuclear weapons, and they're working on ballistic missiles, which threatens NATO, threatens Europe, and ultimately can threaten the United States. So, and again, I'm not necessarily saying that this means America has to intervene there, but the attitude is that the bigger threat is posed by Iran, and the Muslim Brotherhood and these organizations which were involved in the Arab Spring are Sunni, and the Alawite regime in Syria has links to the Shiite regime in Iran. And then we have to consider the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is Hezbollah, because Syria controls Hezbollah, which also controls Lebanon. We're talking about 50,000 rockets pointed at Israel. We're talking about chemical weapons and poison gases that are under the control of Assad, which ultimately may be turned against the insurgents there. The Free Syrian Army does have elements of Al-Queda in it, but not all of the Free Syrian Army are Al-Queda linked. So it's a very confusing problem. But we can't dismiss the fact that as long as Iran pursues nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and this sort of thing, that a policy to contain them won't be used.
Yeah, let's just bring in Mr. Sukant Chandan on this as well, I guess, in London. Now, Mr. Chandan, Mr. Kaplan there in Berkeley telling us that this is, in his opinion, about the threat that the US feels, not just from the Assad government, but also from Iran, he says, and also when it comes to the interests of Israel. Your opinions on that?
Well, just to address the sir from Berkeley referring to the resistance group in Lebanon as a guerrilla. Well, frankly, let's perhaps reflect on the Zionist white settler state as a toad. And a toad likes water, they say in Guinea, but not when the water is boiling. And so Israel likes to have its control and hegemony in the region, but not when there's actually a force, an effective force that actually can defeat it in an open battle, which is what happened with the resistance movement Hezbollah in July 2006. Now, whereas the gentleman from Berkeley fears 50,000 rockets of Hezbollah, what he failed to mention is the unspecified number of nuclear warheads that the Zionist white settler state has, and who it's pointed at we don't know because they don't actually disclose that. And why is Iran a problem to the West in the region? Again, Iran is not a problem in the region unless there is some kind of hegemonic interest of the West with the Zionist state in the region that Iran somehow is an obstacle to. If it's a problem in that regard, when it's a problem for the West, but then it's not a problem for the people of the region, because in the interest of independence and people-centered development, the fact remains that the resistance arc with the Islamic Republic of Iran, with Syria's Assad, and with the resistance movement in Hezbollah and resistance movement in Palestine and also Bashar's Sudan is the only real bulwark against total Zionist hegemony in the region. And also, let's remember that the Zionist state is one of the most effective leaders against the Zionist state, who actually swept across Africa.
May I reply? This gentleman always goes into diatribes.
African states who ensured all African states broke relations with the Zionist state, was overthrown.
Right, okay, Mr. Chandon, I'll stop you there if I may. Let's just allow Mr. Kaplan to give his response. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Kaplan, go ahead.
This gentleman apparently makes a career out of attacking the Jews in Israel and the Israeli state. He calls it a white settler state. Israelis are not all white. He has called for he's interrupting me. He's called for a war against white people. He himself is white.
No, I haven't.
He's called for a war against the white people in the West. He's called for taking over England. And he sits and he spouts revolutionary rhetoric and dogma from the 70s in the Soviet Union, talks about imperialism and all this nonsense. Listen, the fact is, if the Velati Vaki regime was not insisting on developing nuclear weapons, if they were not insisting on developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that can strike Europe and eventually America, they just sent, excuse me, it's my turn to talk. They just sent.
But you just made a false claim. You just made a false claim. You said the Iranians want to develop nuclear weapons.
They are working to develop a new Cold War against the democratic West.
Okay, Mr. Kaplan, if I could just stop you there. You made your point. Let's just bring in our guest in Washington on this as well. Mr. Jatras, when it comes again to what our guests there were mentioning, the threats that the United States says it's facing, our guest there was saying that Iran's nuclear program is considered a threat and that Israeli interests are now under threat. So let's have your opinion on this, how logical those threats are in your opinion and what kind of action they warrant.
Well, let's bring that, that's right, and let's bring back the question of Israel and also how it relates to Syria. It's interesting that while many of Israel's partisans in the United States are enthusiastic about, and I agree with the gentleman in Berkeley, we don't have a dog in this fight, but there are many people here in Washington who are pro-Israel who are much more enthusiastic about supporting the rebels in Syria than you hear from people in Israel, because I think many people in Israel realize that the Ba'athist regime in Damascus is hostile to Israel, but it's been a relatively quiet enemy. The Golan border is among Israel's quietest borders. I don't think that's likely to be improved if, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood takes power in Damascus. We already see the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood, with American support, has taken power in Egypt. Standing behind these powers and the Muslim Brotherhood is the Wahhabist regime in Saudi Arabia, which is the godfather of almost all of these radical Islamic groups. And then we have the increasingly hostile to Israel direction of the Erdogan regime in Turkey. So I don't see where the big plus for Israel is for an intervention by NATO to overthrow the Bashar al-Assad government.
Right, Mr. Chandon, would you agree there with what was just said by our guest?
May I reply?
I'll come back to you. Let's just bring in Mr. Chandon on this first, and I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Mr. Chandon.
No, just to answer the gentleman from Berkeley, two false claims. First, this nonsense about I'm anti-white and all this stuff. If he wants to debate white supremacy and the reality that there is white supremacy in the world, which is promoted by Western imperialism, I can have that debate, and that's a debate that we should have. The second false premise that he's promoting is that Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons.
Okay, let's allow Mr. Chandon to continue.
Ayatollah Khomeini and the current Iranian leadership have said on ethical principle that they do not want to develop nuclear weapons, and that has been accepted by the IAEA. And so that is a total false claim, and it's a total misinformation in line with a war propaganda and containment against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, whereas the gentleman just before as well said that many people
Iran is the greatest exporter.
Mr. Kaplan, we'll come to you if you allow Mr. Chandon to finish. We'll come back to you. Mr. Chandon, you finish what you're going to say. We'll go to our guest in Berkeley.
But I think it's important to remember that the Ba'athist Syrian regime that the Zionist white settler state does see it as a problem, and there's been senior leaders of the Zionist white settler state who are on record as saying they want the overthrow of Assad. Why? whereas it's true that the Jolan has been relatively peaceful, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Lebanese resistance movement Hezbollah, has said that Syria was fundamental to the victory of the resistance against the Zionist state in July 2006. And also, one word, Fajr 5. Where does the Fajr 5 come? Which gave arguably a strategic victory to the resistance in Gaza against the white settler state. Yeah. That's the state of Israel. It came from Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria, and with the help of the Sudanese. So far from the Zionist state being fearful of a post-Assad situation, the reality is these so-called jihadis, they're not jihadis. Jihadis are honorable obligation against oppression. These people are actually mercenaries, death squads of imperialism currently in Algeria,
let's put this point
in
to
Syria,
our guest
in
Berkeley,
Libya.
Mr. Shandon, if I may. Now, our guest in Berkeley, Mr. Kaplan, before you begin to talk, the question right now would be about the identity of those who are fighting the Assad government in Syria, the insurgents. We know we refer there to the Al-Nusra Front, which has been recognized as a terrorist group. We have the Free Syrian Army, and now intelligence reports, according to the Washington Post, say that there is a wave of hatred against these forces because, in its words, their catastrophic misrule under the Free Syrian Army, they're being described basically as death squads. So who is the United States supporting in this war?
Well, again, as I said, I don't think the United States is really putting a dog into the fight fully. And they're not going to do anything to help Assad. Then again, they're not necessarily going to do anything to help the other side. But I'd like to take exception to the gentleman in London talking about Israel being a white settler state. Most of the Jews in Israel are the same race as Arabs. And there are also black Jews, and it's a multicultural society. He goes into these long diatribes where he cites, Soviet-era rhetoric about imperialism and the Zionists and all this other nonsense. The fact is, the Free Syrian Army just exchanged 48 IRGC, that's the Pasdaran, they're members with the Syrian Assad government for about 1,000 prisoners. Iran has a dog in this fight to keep Assad in power, and this is to help Iran develop its future Cold War policy against America and the rest of the West. The fact is that Israel is, of course, always going to be blamed by them, and for some reason, anti-Semitism and attacks on Jews, calling them a white colonial settler state, always has to be introduced. But the fact is, Iran is supporting Hamas in its firing of missiles into Israel. Hezbollah is world terrorist. Iran is not a democracy. Iran is a controlled government,
Mr. Kaplan, I'll stop you there if I may. We are short of time, and I want the guests to stick to the topic of the programme if they can, which is the situation in Syria. Our guest in Washington, Mr. Jackson, let's have your reactions on this. He did mention there, our guest in Berkeley, Iran's role in the conflict here, whether you think you can argue for that, and basically also about whether this was actually pre-planned, as a lot of people are saying, against the resistance front and Israel.
The regime in Damascus has had good relations for many decades with Iran. These are not ideological ties primarily. The government in Tehran is an Islamic revolutionary government with a Shia ideology. The government in Damascus is a secular Arab nationalist regime, similar in some respects to the regime we overthrew in Baghdad in 2003 and brought into power what? A Shiite pro-Iranian regime, one which is not exactly helpful to American regional interests and certainly to Israeli interests. I think it just shows a confusion of ends and means of American policy. I have to agree in part with Mr. Kaplan and disagree in others. It's fair to say we should not have a dog in this fight in Syria, but unfortunately we do have a dog in the fight that through our proxies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, it is the United States, the Obama administration, and I'm sad to say, that has been pushing the envelope and insisting that regime change is the only acceptable outcome in Syria. And I think if we were to back away from that demand and agree that there should be negotiations with no preconditions, we might have a very different outcome. In terms of Damascus's orientation toward Tehran, that has only increased because of the path that the Western powers have taken. I think it's a terrible mistake.
Mr. Chandan, a lot was said after President Assad made his speech, that keynote speech that he made, and a lot of people were saying that that speech took the United States and its allies by surprise because it showed how determined Assad is in his fight and that it showed he is not willing to move an inch back. So do you think that Washington is kind of in a shocked state about where this war between the insurgents and government forces is going to?
No, I don't. And I'll actually just give one point where I might agree with the gentleman in Berkeley is this, that actually the West in general don't want a clear outcome to Syria. They want Syria on a slow boil. Because what Syria does, they don't want the death squads to win on the one hand, and they don't want the state to win on the one hand, because Syria is a feeding ground, is a recruiting ground for all the death squads, so-called jihadis, in the region to be mobilized into Syria and then to be fed into other places to be used. And that's most likely going to be Algeria, which is the next in the crosshairs of NATO currently. So, and also the rebels know this, and Turkey knows this as well. That's why the death squad rebels in Syria, and that's why Erdogan gets
right. Mr. Chandan, I'll stop you if I may. We are very short in time. Just to get the concluding remarks, I guess in Berkeley, a lot of people are saying, while opposition groups inside Syria are saying right now the only loser in this current situation is Syria as a country. So what we need right now is to go ahead with dialogue under any circumstances to save the country. But why do you think that we're not seeing this dialogue happen and the armed opposition and the United States insisting that Assad should leave power?
I'm not so sure you need to save the country. You could create a country for the Kurds to live in. The Alawites, who are Shia-oriented, will probably, unless they're forced out, move to the north to Latakia and might set up their own conclave there. And the fact is, again, Hezbollah is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and Syria is the sponsor for Hezbollah. They do it for Iran. And Hezbollah is the exporter of world terrorism.
I'm really sorry,
Iran.
but we are short of time. Let's get the remarks by guests in Washington as well. Mr. Jatras, why do you think there is this insistence that Assad should resign, and whether that is going to work any longer?
I think it is partly directed geopolitically against Iranian influence, but I think the main thing is that the Obama administration is smoking its own propaganda and getting high on it, and thankfully Hillary Clinton is leaving. They honestly believe that bringing groups like the Muslim Brotherhood to power means democracy, and that somehow this will redound to the benefit of the United States. I don't think, I have to disagree with Mr. Kaplan. I think they do want to wave their regime change magic wand, bring the insurgents to power, and somehow all will be well with the world. And I think they are terribly mistaken in that notion, but that's the way these people think.
Thank you very much, Mr. James Jatras, former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, with us there live from Washington. I'd also like to thank our guest in London, political analyst Mr. Sukant Chandan, and investigative journalist Mr. Lee Kaplan, with us from Berkeley. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being on this edition of The Debate. From me, Homa Lesgi, until our next programme, it's goodbye.